The room smelled like a dead electrical fire and old fruit. Ambassador Adazi Nwosu noticed it the moment the doors opened. She filed it away somewhere behind her left ear, the way she filed everything, quietly, completely, for later use, and walked in. The grand chamber of the Galactic Council was not beautiful. People back on Earth imagined it would be. They imagined something cathedral-like, something that would make a human feel small in the good way, the way standing at the edge of the ocean made you feel small. This was not that. The chamber was round and tiered and packed with bodies in various shapes, colors, and atmospheric suits. It smelled like burning and rot. The lighting was the color of old teeth. Adazi walked to the human delegation table and sat down. 47 species watched her do it. She did not look up. The proceeding was called to order by the arbiter, a being that looked to human eyes like a very tall coat rack that had learned disappointment. Its voice came out of a translator box as something flat and final, the way a stamped document sounds when it hits a desk. The charge was read. Humanity, designated candidate species 7714 Sol, was being assessed for Galactic Council membership. That was the official reason they were all here. That was what the invitation had said. Adazi had read it 6 times on the flight over, looking for what it wasn't saying. She found it now. The charge was not about anything humanity had done. It was about what humanity was built to do. The Council's assessment team, 70 researchers across 12 species, 18 years of study, had produced a document. The document said that human biology was a structural problem. Not the bodies, the inside of the bodies, the cortisol, the way human brains processed loss and kept moving. The way humans invented new strategies mid-failure, mid-fall, mid-dying. The way a human who was told something was impossible did not, as most species did, accept this and redirect their energy. The document used a phrase that took the translator 3 attempts to render in English. The closest it got was, a fire that does not know it is burning. What it meant was, dangerous not through intent, but through nature. A risk not because of what humans wanted, but because of what humans were incapable of stopping themselves from doing. The vote was called 43-4. Humanity was not admitted to the council. Humanity was quarantined. The Sol system sealed. A signal fence across every exit point. No human vessel was permitted to cross. The language used to describe this was careful and clean. It called the quarantine a protective measure. It said this twice. Adazi wrote the word protective on her notepad and drew a small box around it. She looked at the 4 species who had voted against. They were small delegations, nervous in ways their bodies couldn't fully hide. One of them, the Vel, thin and pale and seated 3 tiers up, caught her eye for half a second, and then looked very deliberately at their own hands. She understood that look. She had given it herself, 20 years ago, sitting in a different room while a different verdict came down about something she'd worked a decade to build. That look was the look of someone who did the right thing and knew it hadn't been enough and was already calculating the cost they'd pay for it. She made a note to remember the Vel. The arbiter asked if the Sol delegation wished to make a final statement before the chamber closed. Adazi stood. The room didn't go quiet. It was already quiet, in the way that only a room full of species who have just decided something irreversible goes quiet. That thick, settled silence that has already moved on. She didn't raise her voice. 1 question, she said. The arbiter gestured. Proceed. If we find our own way out, Adazi said, what then? She asked it the way you ask something you already know the answer to. The way a doctor asks a patient if they've been taking their medication. Not cruelty, precision. What happened next was something she had not prepared for. The chamber laughed. Not all of it, but enough. A sound, that came out of 47 different kinds of throat in 47 different registers, some high, some below hearing, some that the translator box rendered as a soft repeating click. And the combined effect was the sound of a room that had collectively decided something was not worth taking seriously. A Daisy sat down. She picked up her pen. She crossed out the word protective in her notepad. She wrote one word next to it instead. Noted. The chamber closed. Delegations filed out. 2 of the council's administrative staff approached the human table with printed copies of the quarantine order, in 12 languages, 7 of which were not human, and a Daisy took them without looking up. She stacked them neatly. She put them in her bag. She walked out of the chamber. The corridor outside was long and pale, and smelled still like burning and old fruit. Her 2 aides fell into step beside her. One of them, Kwame, young, trying very hard not to show that his hands were shaking, started to speak. She raised one finger. He stopped. They walked. At the end of the corridor, there was a window that looked out on the station's exterior, and beyond it, at a distance that made it a small and unremarkable light. The star that Earth orbited. Adeze looked at it for 3 seconds. She opened her comm channel. The voice that answered was her counterpart in the Seoul government's science division, a man named Dr. Vasek, who had spent the last 11 years designing things he was not technically allowed to need yet. "How did it go?" he said. She watched the star. "Start building," she said. She closed the channel. Behind her, somewhere in the chamber, the Arbiter was already processing the next item on the agenda. The quarantine order would be transmitted to Seoul within 6 hours. Signal fences would go live within the week. The council would move on, the way large bodies of power always moved on, with the calm, absolute confidence of something that has never had to wonder what happens when the people it discards refuse to stay discarded. The corridor was quiet. Adeze turned from the window and walked toward the docking bay, her 2 aides behind her, the quarantine papers in her bag, and something sitting in her chest that was not grief and was not rage and was not hope either. It was the feeling of a problem that has just been correctly identified. She had work to do. Kwame caught up beside her, trying again. "Ambassador, what do we do now? Where do we even—" "You ever seen someone build a door," she said, "in a wall that told them there was no door?" He hadn't. "Watch," she said. Every morning, before the rest of the station woke up, Commander Yara Ose recalibrated a jump drive motivator that had no legal reason to exist. She had been doing this since she was 17. The motivator was not connected to a ship yet. It sat on a workbench in a maintenance bay on Titan Station, surrounded by tools and empty coffee cups and star maps she had printed and pinned to the wall. Star maps of systems she had never seen, would legally never see, had been told before she was born she would never see. She calibrated the motivator anyway, every morning, the same way some people made their beds. Her grandmother had called it a prayer. Yara called it math. The quarantine had been in place for 51 years when Yara was born. She was second-generation quarantine. Her mother had been 3 when the verdict came. Her grandmother had watched it happen from a research posting on Mars. A woman in her 50s who had spent her career building frameworks for humanity's first diplomatic contact, and who had, on the night of the vote, written 2 words in her personal log, and then never written about the council again. Yara had found the log once, going through her grandmother's files. The 2 words were, "Start building." She had not known what to do with that. She was 11. She put the file away and went back to school. She did not forget it. The quarantine did not look like a military blockade, which was, in a way, the cruelest part of it. There were no warships at the boundary, no soldiers, just signal fences, automated systems that logged every vessel, flagged any attempt to cross, and transmitted a correction notice that was polite in the way that a locked door is polite. Words like compliance, Words like advisory. Words like for the safety of all parties. The signal fences worked not through force, but through consequence. Any human vessel that crossed the boundary would be logged. That log would go to the council. The council would respond to the sole government. The sole government, still fractured in those early years, still arguing about whether cooperation or defiance was the smarter long-term play, would receive pressure. Economic pressure. Trade terms adjusted. Resource classifications changed. Access to council-aligned neutral stations quietly revoked. The fence was made of paperwork. It held for decades. Inside it, Earth and its colonies burned through each other. Wars that were not called wars. Famines that were called logistics failures. Political collapses that were called restructuring. The sole system had the resources to sustain itself. Barely, painfully, with nothing left over for the mistakes that large civilizations need the room to make. And what it did not have was a direction to aim its anger. For a while, the anger aimed inward. That was the ugliest chapter. Yara had studied it. The years where the quarantine's pressure turned soul against itself, where the word council became either a curse or a goal, depending on who was saying it, where several governments rose and fell on the single question of whether to keep trying for council membership or to burn the application and find another way. The other way won, not through idealism, through exhaustion. The Sol Compact formed in a cargo bay on Titan. 12 delegates. Cold lighting. A table that had been someone's dining table 2 weeks before, and still had a coffee ring on one corner that no one had cleaned off. No ceremony. The only record of the founding was a transcript and a series of handshake photos that would later become the most reproduced images in human history. Though at the time they looked like what they were, 12 tired people who had run out of other options. The Compact's charter was 40 pages long and had 3 sentences that mattered. The first, humanity will not petition for membership in a body that has decided our nature is a crime. The second, we will build what we need to survive without permission. The third, the one that Yara had memorized at age 9 for a school assignment and never lost, we proceed. 2 words like a door opening, like a held breath finally released. The charter made no mention of the council, not a grievance, not an appeal, not even an acknowledgement of the quarantine, except as a background condition, the way you mention the weather when you're explaining why you built a roof. The council, when it became aware of the compact, flagged it as a minor political reorganization, a coping mechanism, something to watch. They were right that it was something to watch. Yara joined the compact's military engineering division at 22. She was not a soldier. She was what the division called a problem mover, someone whose specific skill was looking at a thing that could not be done and working backward from its last impossible step until she found the first possible one. The jump drive motivator on her workbench was one of 19 she had built over 8 years. The project had no official name. It existed in 3 different budget categories simultaneously to avoid appearing in any single oversight report. The people working on it were officially assigned to other things. If you asked them directly what they were building, they would tell you they were building nothing yet, only the tools to build the thing, which was technically true and practically beside the point. What they were building was a ship that could cross the boundary without triggering the signal fence, not by breaking the fence, by going somewhere the fence had never thought to watch. Dr. Pita Havili, a cartographer who had spent 30 years making the most exhaustive maps of the inside of a Liebel box that had ever existed, had found something 3 years before. A gap. Not a hole in the fence. A region the fence didn't reach, because the council had classified the region as worthless and stopped paying attention to it 18 light-years past the boundary's edge. Dark, between 2 dense stars. No strategic value. The gap led somewhere the council had never mapped. Havili had brought the data to Yara on a Tuesday. She had looked at it for 4 hours without speaking. She had run the numbers twice, then a third time. Then she had said, "We're going to need a better motivator." She started on the 20th one the following morning. On the night the compact finally approved the mission, after 3 years of argument, and 2 failed test jumps that she did not let herself think about before sleeping, Yara went back to her grandmother's file. She read the 2 words again. Start building. She thought about a woman on Mars, 51 years ago, watching the verdict come through. Watching a room full of 47 species laugh at a question. Writing 2 words in the dark and closing the document and going to sleep. She thought about what it cost to write those 2 words in that moment. That quiet. That committed to a direction when every door was closed. The motivator on the workbench hummed in the dark behind her. Yara put the file away. She went to bed. She had work in the morning. The ship was called the Audacity. Not as a joke. The crew of 22 had argued about the name for 2 weeks and come back to it every time. Some names were too proud. Some were too poetic. Some were the kind of name you put on a ship when you want the history books to call it something noble. And this crew had no interest in naming a ship for the history books. They named it for what the mission was. What the mission was audacious. Simple as that. Dr. Peta Havili had found the gap by accident. He was not the kind of man who found things by adventure. He was 70 years old and had bad knees, and took his coffee in a particular way that required 3 specific steps, which he had laminated and posted above every coffee station he regularly used. He had spent 30 years mapping the interior of a sealed system with the slow, grinding patience of someone who decided early on that if he was living inside a box, the least he could do was know every corner of it. The gap showed up in a routine cross-reference between signal fence calibration data, which the Council transmitted to Saul as part of the quarantine's administrative protocol, a detail that still struck Havili as an extraordinary oversight, and his own deep space survey of the boundary's far edge. The fence was calibrated around what the Council had decided mattered. The region between the 2 dead stars, Sol designation DS-4417 and DS-4418, both cold, both stripped of useful material, both classified as navigational debris, did not matter. The fence didn't curve around it. The fence ended before it. The Council had drawn a wall and left a gap because they had looked at the gap and seen nothing worth enclosing. Havili stared at his data for 6 hours. He thought about how the Council had classified humanity as a threat species and locked them in a box, and how the box had a hole in it that the Council had never bothered to notice because it looked like nothing. He thought that he, personally, was also the kind of thing that looked like nothing. He sent the data to Yara. The Audacity launched on a Thursday because Thursdays had no significance, and Yara had specifically wanted a day that had no significance. No symbolic date, no anniversary, no message to history, just a Thursday. The crew ran through their checks. The motivator, the 20th one, the one that had sat on Yara's workbench for 8 years, read clean. Havili sat at navigation and drank his coffee in 3 specific steps, and then set the cup down in a spot where it would not slide. Yara stood at the command console. She thought about saying something. She thought about what people said in moments like this in the stories, the speeches, the toasts, the declarations about the human spirit. She thought, no. Run the jump calculation 1 more time, she said. Havili ran it. Clean, he said. Move the rock, Yara said. That was the speech. The jump took 11 seconds. What those 11 seconds felt like is difficult to describe with accuracy, because the people who came out the other side all described it differently. Havili said it felt like being turned off and on. The ship's engineer, a young woman named Sujin, said it felt like the universe forgot her name for a moment and then remembered it wrong. One of the younger crew members, who had never been on a jump-capable vessel before, Simply said, it felt loud, which made no physical sense and was somehow the most accurate description. For Yara, it felt like 11 seconds of every part of her brain screaming at the same volume at the same time about the same thing. The thing was, this might not work. She had run the math. She had built the motivator. She trusted the math. She trusted the motivator. She also knew, in the specific cellular way of someone who had spent her career moving problems through the last impossible step, that math was not reality until it was reality. For 11 seconds, it was not reality yet. And then it was. The stars were wrong. That was the first thing. The star field through the forward window was completely unfamiliar. No sol, no council boundary markers, no navigational signals she recognized. Just stars that nobody on the ship had ever seen from this angle. In this arrangement, from this side. They had made it. Havili was already cross-referencing the star field against his deep space surveys, making small sounds that Yara had learned to read as the sounds of a man updating a lifetime of maps. Su-Jin was running a systems check with the focused calm of someone who processed relief through productivity. The rest of the crew were quiet. Yara looked at the star field. She stood there and waited to feel what she had expected to feel. She had imagined this moment for 20 years, roughly, since the workbench, since the laminated star maps on the wall. She had imagined the feeling of coming through the other side of the boundary and seeing open space, and she had imagined it would feel like something large and clean and final. The feeling at the end of a very long run, when your lungs stop burning and you realize you made it. That feeling did not come. What came instead was something she had no name for, something that was not joy, and was not relief, and was not quite fear either, but had edges of all three, something that felt less like an ending, and more like standing at the bottom of a very large staircase in a dark building, and realizing the lights are yours to turn on. She did not tell the crew any of this. "Good jump," she said. "Havili, start the full survey. Su-Jin, I want a systems report in 20. Everyone else, we have work." The crew moved. Yara stayed at the window for another moment. She looked at the stars nobody had named yet, in the space nobody had drawn a fence around. Past the boundary of everything she had ever been told was the edge of what was possible for her. She turned back to her console. She opened the comm channel back to Sol, a tight beam relay through the gap. Slow, but it would get through. She thought again about what to say. She thought about her grandmother's file. 2 words, all those years ago. The specific kind of certainty it took to write 2 words in the dark and trust them to carry. She kept it simple. "The door's open," she said. She closed the channel. Behind her, Havili was already naming the new stars. The Yarveth had 17 words for the loneliness of being the only one of your kind in a room. Yara learned this in the first hour of first contact, through a translator that was still calibrating, in a docking bay that smelled like ammonia and warm metal, while a Yarveth elder stood across from her and watched her with eyes that were wide and dark and doing something complicated. She learned 4 of the 17 words that day. The elder, whose name translated roughly as still water, taught them carefully, one at a time, with pauses between them, as if each word needed room. Yara did not speak during the pauses. She just listened. This turned out to be exactly the right thing to do, though she had not planned it as a strategy. She was just tired. The council had classified the Yarveth as pre-civilizational fauna. The classification was 40 years old. The researchers who made it had spent 11 days on the Yarveth homeworld before submitting their report. They had observed tool use, social organization, and what they called rudimentary symbolic communication, which was, it turned out, the first 4 levels of a linguistic system so dense and layered that it had taken the Compact's translation team 3 years to begin to understand it. The 17 words for loneliness were from the 6th level. There were 9 levels. Pre-civilizational fauna. Stillwater looked at Yara when she heard this. The translator rendered her response as, "They spent 11 days here and named us animals." "How long did they study you?" 18 years, Yara said. "And what did they call you?" "A fire that doesn't know it's burning," Stillwater replied. Stillwater's face did something that the translator could not fully capture. The closest it got was, "That is almost a compliment." The compact's opening line, in every first contact, was the same. "We were told we didn't qualify either." It was not a strategy exactly. Yara had not planned it. It had come out in the first contact after the Yarveth, a species called the Marin, who lived in 3 moon systems and had been denied council membership for reasons that amounted to, they asked too many questions. And it had been the right thing to say, because it was true. And because true things in first contact situations were the only things that worked. The Marin had gone quiet when they heard it. Then one of them had said, "How many of you are there?" "1 species," Yara said, "so far." 2 years later, the Marin were the 2nd member of the Terran Compact. Over the following decade, word moved through the dark corridors the Council had abandoned. Through the unmapped spaces, the dead star regions, the classified as nothing gaps. And species that had been declined, demoted, ignored, and filed under "not our problem" began to hear about an organization that had a different opening line. 11 species in 30 years. 43 inhabited systems. A trade network built in the margins. The Compact's governing structure looked, from the outside, like it had been designed by someone who had never seen a government before. Rotating chairs, consensus decisions, voting weight that factored in population, yes, but also the Council's documented history with each species. How long they had been excluded, how much that exclusion had cost them, how recently they had been harmed. A species that had been denied membership for a century had more weight than a species that had been denied last year. Not more power, more weight. The difference mattered. Council observers who monitored the Compact from a distance called the structure unstable and inefficient, and predicted its collapse within a decade. The decade passed. The Compact was still there. It was slow and loud, and the meetings ran long, and there were 3 separate occasions where the governing chamber's session had to be recessed, because 2 member species had a fundamental disagreement about time itself that took 6 weeks to resolve. But it worked. The way things work when everyone in the room has been told at some point that they didn't belong in a room. Everyone was paying attention. Everyone was invested. Nobody was coasting on the assumption that the institution would be fine without them. Yara was 51 when the intelligence report came through. It was flagged routine, buried in a Compact monitoring brief about Council internal politics. She almost missed it. The 4 species who had voted against the quarantine on the original Council, the small delegations, the nervous ones, had been quietly managed over the preceding decade. Their committee seats reduced, their trade agreements reviewed, their access to Council resources made contingent on alignment with Council positions. One of them had lost 2 of its member colonies through what was officially called administrative reclassification. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be called a punishment. Just the slow, patient application of consequences to the act of having done the right thing. Yara sat with the report for a long time. She thought about Stillwater, who had taught her 4 words for loneliness. She thought about the Marin, who asked too many questions. She thought about 11 species across 43 systems who had built something in the dark because they had been told, politely and thoroughly, that the light was not for them. She thought about 4 delegations who had raised their hands against the current, and then watched the current punish them for it, slowly, over decades, in ways that were always technically explainable. She added all 4 species to the Compact's contact list. Her aide, a young man named Davo who had grown up on Titan and had never once in his life asked for anyone's permission to do anything, looked at the list and then at her. "That'll make the council nervous," he said. "Good," she said. "Nervous people pay attention. Pays to be paid attention to." She closed the report. Adaze Nwosu was 94 years old and living in a retirement facility on the Titan coast, where the low gravity was good for her joints, and the view through the dome showed Saturn at an angle that still, after 30 years, made her set down whatever she was holding. She watched the news feed on a Tuesday afternoon. The feed showed the Compact's latest census figures: population count across all member species, system count, the breakdown of the governing body's current composition. 31 species. Humanity was the smallest. Adaze watched the numbers for a long time. She thought about the chamber, the smell of burning and old fruit, the vote, the laugh that 47 species made when she asked one question. She thought about the 2 words she had said into a comm channel 50 years ago, standing at a corridor window, watching the small and unremarkable light of her star. "Start building." She made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was not quite a cry. It was the specific sound of someone who has lived long enough to see the thing they started become something larger than the start. She turned off the news feed. She looked at Saturn. She let herself sit with it for a while. Outside the dome, the stars were thick and unhidden and entirely, unapologetically there. The new human ambassador was 29 years old and had never been to Earth. She had been born on a station in the Marin system. She had grown up speaking 3 languages before she could read. Because in the Compact, you learned the languages of your neighbors the way you learned to walk. Not as a special skill, just as a thing people did. Her name was Lena Vasek Okafor, and she had taken the ambassador post because she believed in the Compact with the clean, practical certainty of someone who had never known anything else. She stood at the front of the Compact's full assembly and read the Council's ultimatum aloud. She read it in the flat, careful tone of someone reading a menu item they do not intend to order. The ultimatum said, the Terran Compact was an unrecognized political body operating in violation of Council-designated quarantine parameters. Its expansion into Council-adjacent space was a destabilizing action. Its recruitment of species currently within the Council's administrative jurisdiction was interference. The Compact had 60 standard days to dissolve its governing structure, submit to Council oversight, and return all member species to their prior classifications, or be designated an active threat. Lena finished reading. She set the document down. 31 delegations sat in the chamber. The room was quiet. Not the heavy quiet of fear. The particular quiet of people who have already made up their minds and are waiting for the speaker to catch up. She looked at the 60-day deadline. She thought about what an ultimatum was, at its root. A last offer before force. The grammar of someone who expected the other side to fold. She thought, they still don't know what we are. We're not going to dissolve, she said. Nobody in the chamber looked surprised, but we're not going to fight either. Not their way. She looked around the room. 31 species. 11 who had been denied council membership outright. 6 who had never been approached by the council at all. 4 who had been members and quietly left, or quietly been pushed, depending on who was telling the story. And 1 species, the founding one, the smallest, that had been locked in a box and told to stay there. We're going to send them an invitation, she said. The document took 3 weeks to write, not because it was long. It was 4 pages, because every line had to be right. It was written by a committee that included representatives from 9 member species, with edits from 12 more, reviewed by the Compact's founding legal architects, 3 of whom were Yarveth, whose 9-level language system turned out to produce lawyers of extraordinary precision, and it went through 62 drafts before Lena read the final version and felt the specific settling sensation of a thing that had found its correct shape. The document was not a counter-ultimatum. It was an invitation. It was addressed not to the Galactic Council as an institution, but to each of the 47 species that held council membership, individually, by name, in their own language, in the appropriate formal register for each culture, with the correct honorifics, checked and verified by a Yarveth translation team that understood language the way other species understood architecture, as something you built to hold weight. The opening line was the same in all 47 versions. You can join us instead. The document explained what the compact was, its structure, its voting system, the weight given to histories of exclusion, the trade network, the governing principles. It was written with no hostility, no accusation, and no mention of the quarantine or the original verdict, except in one place. A single line that said plainly, "We began because we were not permitted to begin any other way." Then it moved on. It outlined what membership in the compact would look like for a current council species. It was honest about the complications. The compact was slower and louder than the council. Its consensus processes were difficult. Its commitment to equal weight meant that powerful species carried less automatic authority than they were accustomed to. It was also honest about what the compact offered that the council did not. It offered the Yarveths 17 words for loneliness, and the Marins 700 questions, and the human tendency to run the math one more time in the dark before going to sleep, and the Vel's particular gift for finding peace in a room that had just almost broken apart. It offered 31 species who had been told at various volumes that they were not enough, and who had collectively decided that this was not a verdict they were required to accept. The document was transmitted to all 47 council species within 24 hours of completion. The council's response came in two parts. The first part was official. The council issued a statement calling the invitation an act of political destabilization. The statement used 14 words that translated across species to the same basic concept. This is not how things are done. The second part was less official. Within 6 hours of the invitation's transmission, the Vel, small delegation, nervous, the ones who had voted against the quarantine on the night everything started and had been paying for it in slow, careful ways ever since, sent a private message to Lena's office. The message was 4 words. Tell us what's required. The other 3 species who had voted against the quarantine original responded within 48 hours. Then 2 of the smallest current council members. Then a species that had been full council members for 200 years and had, privately, been watching the compact's trade network eat into their margins with the quiet admiration of people watching someone solve a problem they'd given up on. The council could not declare war on an invitation. They tried, briefly, to declare the invitation itself a hostile act. 3 separate council members pointed out, in session, that this argument made them sound like people who had run out of better arguments. The session was not going well. In the grand chamber, the same room, the same pale light, the same smell of ozone and old fruit, the arbiter read the compact's invitation aloud. They lived a long time. When it finished reading, the chamber was silent. The arbiter set the document down. The silence stayed. The seat had been empty for 50 years. It was at the far end of the compact's governing table, in a modest room on Titan that had been a cargo bay once, and still, if you looked, had the ghosts of cargo markings on the floor. The seat had been placed there on the day the compact ratified its charter. No one had ever put a nameplate on it. No one had ever explained it. It was just there, a chair at a table, waiting. Dr. Pita Havili was 91 years old, and walked with a cane, and took his coffee in 3 specific steps. that had now been laminated and posted in 7 different systems across 43 inhabited worlds. He sat down in the chair. His knees complained about it. He had been ignoring his knees for 20 years, and he was not about to let them have a meaningful moment. He opened his star maps on the table in front of him. They were enormous now. 31 species of cartographers had been adding to them for decades. Systems upon systems, corridors, gaps, dark spaces, new stars, dead stars, things that didn't have names yet and were waiting for someone to give them one. There was so much still unmapped. He found the nearest blank region, put his finger on it. Here, he thought, start here. He began to work. Outside, the stars did not care about the Council's ultimatum, or the Compact's invitation, or the 50 years of paperwork and fences and signals that had been built to keep one species contained. Stars were not built for caring about those things. They burned for their own reasons, on their own schedules, in their own time. A fire that didn't know it was burning. And the darkness around them, vast and dark and full of unmapped space, waited to be known.